Yo, I am Guido Jallo, the owner of the Afri-Culture Concepts YouTube channel. Today, I wanted to cover a book that was published in 1968 by Winthrop D. Jordan called White Over Black, The American Attitude Towards the Negro 1550 to 1812, not to babble in victimhood and trauma bonding, but to briefly expose the way different groups of Africans appeared when encountered by British elites, and to bring out the fact that even during the colonial days, outsiders knew there was a difference from North Africans and Africans further south of the Sahara. I want you to pay close attention to the fact that some of these Europeans did not ignore the inaccurate descriptions and corrected their own inconsistencies of their descriptions of the different African populations that they encountered. So make it clear and prepare you what to listen for is an overgeneralization of some previous explorers saying that all Africans appear to be black, more than likely because they were darker than the average Western European at that time. But later, after further investigation, realizing that the previous descriptions were inaccurate and ultimately illustrating morphological diversity within the African continent, even illustrating the fact that all Africans south of the Sahara did not share the same morphological features. But before we go into this, I must add, and I definitely must stress, that these outdated descriptions do not reflect my personal views of Africans south of the Sahara. It is only to illustrate what people of old that went out on a limb to discover the unknown had encountered and described, in order to add more accurate resistance to the misinformation that is so abundant within the YouTube algorithm. This should not take very long at all, as it just covers a few points made within the book. If you would like to expound more on the details of this book, do yourself a favor and Google the title of the book so that you could purchase your own personal copy of it. White Over Black originated as Jordan's doctoral thesis at Brown. He arrived in Providence with an interest in the history of prejudice and an inclination toward interdisciplinary study. The resources available to him at Brown shaped his course of study. By the time of Jordan's passing away in 2007, at the age of 76, he had become a leading American scholar. He was, as many eulogies noted, one of the few historians to have won a prestigious Bancroft Prize on 2 occasions. Once you go into the book and get to the subtitle that is named First Impressions, Initial English Confrontations with Africans, which is part 1, it says, when the Atlantic nations of Europe began expanding overseas in the 16th century, Portugal led the way in Africa and to the east, while Spain founded a great empire in America. It was not until the reign of Elizabeth that Englishmen came to realize that overseas exploration and plantations could bring home wealth, power, glory, and fascinating information. By the early years of the 17th century, Englishmen had developed a taste for empire and for tales of adventure and discovery. More than is usual in human affairs, one man, the great chronicler Richard Hakluyt, had roused enthusiasm for Western planning and had stirred the nation with his monumental compilation, The Principal Navigations, Voyages, Traffics, and Discoveries of the English Nation. Here was a work to widen a people's horizons. Its exhilarating accounts of voyages to all quarters of the globe, some by foreigners in translation, constituted a national hymn, a sermon, an adventure story, and a scientific treatise. It was these accounts, together with ones added during the first quarter of the 17th century by Hakluyt's successor Samuel Purchas, which first acquainted Englishmen at home with the newly discovered lands of Africa. English voyagers did not touch upon the shores of West Africa until after 1550, nearly a century after Prince Henry the Navigator had mounted the sustained Portuguese thrust southward for a water passage to the Orient. Usually Englishmen came to Africa to trade goods with the natives. The principal hazards of these ventures proved to be climate, disease, and the jealous opposition of the Portingos, who had long since entrenched themselves in forts along the coast. The earliest English descriptions of West Africa were written by adventurous traders, men who had no special interest in converting the natives or, except for the famous Hawkins voyages, in otherwise laying hands on them. Extensive English participation in the slave trade did not develop until well into the 17th century. The first permanent English settlement on the African coast was at Cormanton in 1631, and the Royal African Company was not chartered for another 40 years. Initially, therefore, English contact with Africans did not take place primarily in a context which prejudged the Negro as a slave, at least not as a slave of Englishmen. Rather, Englishmen met Negroes merely as another sort of men. Englishmen found the natives of Africa very different from themselves. Negroes looked different. Their religion was unchristian. Their manner of living was anything but English. They seemed to be a particularly libidinous sort of people. All of these clusters of perceptions were related to each other, though they may be spread apart for inspection. And they were related also to circumstance of contact in Africa, to previously accumulated traditions concerning that strange and distant continent, and to certain special qualities of English society on the eve of its expansion into the New World. After that, you will see the next subtitle is named The Blackness Without, which goes into the main subject of this video. It states that the most arresting characteristic of the newly discovered African was his color. Travelers rarely failed to comment upon it. Indeed, when describing Negroes, they frequently began with complexion and then moved on to dress, or rather lack of it, and manners. At Cape Verde, these people are all black and are called Negroes without any apparel, saving before their privities. Robert Baker's narrative poem recounting his 2 voyages to the West African coast in 1562 and 1563 first introduced the natives with these engaging lines. And entering in a river, we see a number of black souls, whose likeliness seemed meant to be, but all as black as coals. Their captain comes to me as naked as my nail, not having wit or honesty to cover once his tail. Even more sympathetic observers seem to find blackness a most salient quality in Negroes, saying, although the people were black and naked, yet they were civil. Englishmen actually describe Negroes as black, an exaggerated term which in itself suggests that the Negro's complexion had powerful impact upon their perceptions. Even the peoples of northern Africa seemed so dark that Englishmen tended to call them black and let further refinements go by the board. Blackness became so generally associated with Africa that every African seemed to be a black man. In Shakespeare's day, the Moors, including Othello, were commonly portrayed as pitchy black, and the terms Moor and Negro used almost interchangeably, with curious inconsistency. However, Englishmen recognized that Africans south of the Sahara were not at all the same people as the much more familiar Moors. Sometimes they referred to Negroes as black Moors to distinguish them from the peoples of North Africa. During the 17th century, the distinction became more firmly established, and Indian writers came to stress the difference in color, partly because they delighted in correcting their predecessors, and partly because Negroes were being taken up as slaves and Moors, increasingly, were not. In the more detailed and accurate reports about West Africa of the 17th century, moreover, Negroes in different regions were described as varying considerably in complexion. In England, however, the initial impression of Negroes was not appreciably modified. The firmest fact about the Negro was that he was black. The powerful impact which the Negro's color made upon Englishmen must have been partly owing to suddenness of contact. Through the Bible, as well as the arts and literature of antiquity and the Middle Ages offered some slight introduction to the Ethiop. England's immediate acquaintance with black-skinned peoples came with relative rapidity. While the virtual monopoly held by Venetian ships in England's foreign trade prior to the 16th century meant that people much darker than Englishmen were not entirely unfamiliar, really black men were virtually unknown except as vaguely referred to in the hazy literature about the sub-Sahara which had filtered down from antiquity. Native West Africans probably first appeared in London in 1554. In that year, 5 Negroes, as the legitimate trader William Thorson reported, were taken to England, kept till they could speak the language, and then brought back again to be a help to Englishmen who were engaged in trade with Negroes on the coast. Hakluyt's later discussion of these Negroes, who he said could well agree with our meats and drinks, though the cold and moist air does somewhat offend them, suggests that these black Moors were a novelty to Englishmen. In this respect, the English experience was markedly different from that of the Spanish and Portuguese, who for centuries had been in close contact with North Africa and had actually been invaded and subjected by people both darker and more highly civilized than themselves. The impact of the Negro's color was the more powerful upon Englishmen. Moreover, because England's principal contact with Africans came in West Africa and the Congo, where men were not merely dark, but almost literally black, one of the fairest-skinned nations suddenly came face to face with one of the darkest peoples of the earth. Viewed from one standpoint, Englishmen were merely participating in Europe's discovery that the strange men whose stud revealed by European expansion overseas came in an astounding variety of colors. A Spanish chronicle translated into English in 1555 was filled with wonder at this diversity. One of the marvelous things that God uses in the composition of man is color, which doubtless cannot be considered without great admiration in beholding one to be white and another black, being colors utterly contrary. Some like whites to be yellow, which is between black and white, and other of other colors as it were of diverse livers. As this passage suggests, the juxtaposition of black and white was the most striking marvel of all. And for Englishmen, this juxtaposition was more than a curiosity. In England, perhaps more than in Southern Europe, the concept of blackness was loaded with intense meaning. Long before they found that some men were black, Englishmen found in the idea of blackness a way of expressing some of their most ingrained values. No other color except white conveyed so much emotional impact. Some of the main points that you can extract from these passages are that 1. Descriptions and findings are subject to change over time, as the investigator may run across new information or new ways of observing information. Another point you can extract from these passages are that early colonial people noticed not only difference of skin color between people of North Africa and people of West Africa, but they said that these people were totally different from each other, despite them both being indigenous Africans. Another good point made is the fact that the writers gave recognition to the differences of Moors and Black Moors, not only by physical description, but also by illustrating how they witnessed Black Moors or Negroes in general being used for slavery of a much lesser extent to the other Moors. Although Europeans have made the mistake in the past of calling Africa the alleged dark continent, later Europeans of similar times and of similar persuasions have corrected those inaccurate descriptions of the African continent. And these materials can be used to illegitimize claims of terms like sub-Saharan Africa to be a racist term. We can see clearly that by the time Europeans began to exert their presence on the continent, sub-Saharan Africans were much more morphologically diverse than North Africa. But most notably, the African peoples that had much darker skin lived mostly in Africa south of the Sahara. There is absolutely nothing wrong with being of sub-Saharan African descent whatsoever. The problem lies within the lack of historical consciousness of this region. But an even deeper point I would like to bring up that may have went over your heads, this over-emotional hyper-focus on blackness is more than likely of European thought in nature, and takes away from your humanity in the same fashion that colonial Europeans may have done in the past in order to justify acts of slavery and oppression to darker humans. Regardless of skin color and the bad histories that have taken place in the past, in relation to this racial or skin color issue, all people are humans. Skin color or morphological appearance does not measure the supremacy or mastery of a particular group of humans, but their contributions to advancing human progress does. Lack of information only causes chaos, as we witness it every day on YouTube and other social media platforms. This channel is here to add balance to the chaos and spread more accurate information about the histories and diverse nature of African peoples in the African continent. I hope you like this short breakdown of this material in order to support the fact that Africa does not equal black. Please like, share, and subscribe so you can help this channel grow. And last but not least, thanks for watching Afri-Culture Concepts. Peace.